Hi folks, Ryan Honeyman here from Lift Economy. Many folks have come to us over the last 10 years and asked, how do I get more involved in creating an economy that works for the benefit of all life? They also ask, what skills and experiences do I need to help make this transition? So 3 years ago, we created something called the Next Economy MBA to help address this and similar questions. Lift Economy's Next Economy MBA is an online course that's designed for entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, students, recent graduates, employees, and folks who want to learn more about transformational Next Economy strategies and businesses. Join the growing alumni network of nearly 250 alumni who've gone through this program and learned essential skills and hopefully built lifelong relationships for catalyzing businesses in the emergent and regenerative economy. So we encourage you to check out our course. You can go to lifteconomy.com/MBA. The next course, Cohort 7, starts on September 21st, 2021. So once again, go to www.lifteconomy.com/MBA. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Jed, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Great to be with you.
Well, Jed, let's start with a bit about your background. Similar to you, I don't have an MSW, but my early path was looking at social work. And so I'd love for folks to get a sense of some of the stuff you were doing before you got into the sort of quote unquote impact investing world.
Sure. Well, in a lot of ways, I feel like I was bred to do this work. My dad was a Presbyterian minister who focused a lot on social welfare and justice ministries. My mom was a social worker whose private practice focused on young women and women in transition, kind of gender issues. I started in, I guess it was third or fourth grade when I attended my first anti-war march on my own. And then was a peer tutor in Spanish Harlem when I was in seventh grade and a youth development, youth activist for the first part of my career that brought me here to San Francisco, where I was the founding director of the Larkin Street Youth Center, which is a program that works with homeless kids and teenage prostitutes here in San Francisco.
Excellent. Yeah, and Jed and I, for listeners, we had talked. I used to work at Seneca Center, which was a similar youth services agency in San Francisco and in the Bay Area. So we have some connections there.
That's great. But I think that through that experience, I kind of found that I became very frustrated with the traditional way to think about nonprofits and philanthropy and governmental funding. And so by the time I was 29, I kind of blew up my career track and did a left-hand turn and just decided I didn't want to do nonprofit work anymore. And I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, but I knew I didn't want to be a part of that process because I felt like the way that money moved within that sector is very much a function of politics, perception, and persuasion as opposed to performance. And I think that's a little less so today, 30 years later, because there's been so much focus on metrics and performance and accountability and transparency. But at the time, in the mid-'80s, I really felt like the way that I got money was by kind of preaching and telling stories about what we were doing, all of which were true, but none of which really were connected with the quality of the work that we actually were doing with kids on the street and the lives that we were really transforming through the process of our programming. And so I just thought, there's got to be something else. I got to come at this from a different way. And so that's what I kind of went off in search of when I was 29.
And so bringing us a little closer, not all the way quite to today. So you got into what I imagine was not quite named impact investing or impact back. Can you tell that sort of middle path story?
Well, I mean, just briefly, without going into all the particulars, through a variety of things, I got connected with a financier who had kind of reached the same place I had, but from a very different place, from a very different path. And what he was saying was, look, I want to use some of the strategies and tactics and practices that created my wealth in order to manage my charitable giving. And so how do we think about philanthropy as a form of investing? And how do we think about grants as capital? And so that really started me down a path. I became the founding director of the Roberts Enterprise Development Fund. I ran an initial fund that was the R&D kind of process that then created the strategy for REDF, and was involved in working in this area for about 11 years. And out of that experience, I kind of, toward the end of that time, I kind of woke up and realized that I had become completely agnostic in terms of the delivery vehicle. So I didn't really care if something was a nonprofit or a for-profit or a cooperative or a hybrid. And I'd stopped thinking in terms of, grants versus investing. I just started thinking in terms of capital and, how do you deploy capital? What's the profile of the performance that you want to create by virtue of that capital deployment? And I just began thinking in this more integrated, holistic way that I came to call blended value, and had been on the founding board of Pacific Community Ventures, had been, doing more and more writing about the idea that asset owners, in particular, I focused on foundations, should really be using all of their assets to advance their mission, as opposed to simply 5% of their payout in order to do grant making, as it were. And that work kind of brought me to the attention of a whole host of for-profit, mission-driven investors who at that time in the 90s were funding, the Ben and Jerry's and the Patagonias and the Body Shops. I mean, these types of for-profit enterprises. And what was intriguing was that at that time, we had socially responsible investing, we had screened portfolios. This was really just at the early stages of ESG and ESG integration. And what people were saying is, look, we have ways to think about negative value and, bad things in our portfolio, but how do we think about positive value? And I think there was then in the 90s, you had a whole generation of new asset owners who came forward who really wanted to draw as short a line as possible between their deployment of capital and the generation of measurable community level impact and change. And so that's really part of a conversation that I've been involved in with our community for, I guess, 29 years now. That's a little shocking to say it that way, but any of that. So for a long time. And I think it's kind of funny because in some ways, yes, I mean, I feel like I've really worked hard on these ideas and promoting them and everything. But I think Chairman Mao said that a leader is someone who finds a parade and goes to stand in front of it. And I think that's all I've done, has been fortunate enough to be a part of this whole movement of actors, not only in the US, of course, but internationally, who've been exploring these ideas.
Yeah, I feel like you're a bit like, you also were the first employee in the Obama campaign, and you just sort of like one of those guys who just seems to be in the right place.
like Zelig, or what was that Tom Hanks movie?
Yes,
where it pops up all over the place.
Forrest Gump, yeah.
Forrest Gump, exactly. Yeah. So variation on a theme.
Yeah, and so so getting into some of the current, so talk to me about how this book and your ideas started to formulate around the purpose of capital. How did that start to form in your mind?
Well, I think that in 2000, I wrote a paper. I was on the faculty at Harvard Business School, and I wrote a paper called The Nature of Returns that explored the whole idea of what is it that we're really trying to do? How do we think about the value that we're trying to create? And so that kind of framed about 20 years of work around that idea. And what I think happened was I was very focused, as all of us are, on how do you do this? How do you structure capital? How do you measure its performance? How do you define impact? All these issues with regard to the execution of your strategy. And about 3 years ago, I kind of woke up and I realized that, geez, I'd written 7 books, either co-authored or edited or worked with other collaborators, had written God knows how many papers. I'd been working with, 5 families who were deploying I think it was about 1.4 or $5 billion in assets. And I realized that in the course of all this and sitting on these finance committees for these families, that all of my conversations had devolved to this question of strategy and tactics. And as I looked at the field, I kind of felt like, that happened to all of us. Like we kind of had gone down this path of, that the real challenge is how do you do this? And I kind of reached this place about 3 years ago where I realized that part of our problem is that the how is so hard relative to execution because we blew by the first question, which is why. Like, what is it that we're really trying to do? How do we really understand and define the purpose of capital? And if we have, I thought, greater clarity around those questions and issues, then the solutions would come more easily. And I think that in some ways I felt that, either in conversations with other investors or in conversations with some of my own families, we had deployed capital. We're all sitting around the finance committee table, and you look at each other and you're like, well, so that's it? Like this is impact? And you're kind of like, no, this isn't impact. This is just a step towards something else, but what is that something else? And so I realized that a lot of the conversation in the field was still revolving around this issue of trade-offs, this issue of doing well and doing good, as opposed to optimizing value. Questions that, to my mind, are not new questions. They're fundamentally kind of old questions, if you will, but because we're the latest to frame them, we think that they're new. And because of the way we think today, I think we approach a lot of this in kind of an ahistorical frame. We really are not looking backward in order to bring knowledge and wisdom and understanding forward into how we create new solutions. We're so focused on looking forward that we kind of forget like how we got here and how that influences and informs how we think about what we do. And so I decided that instead of kind of promoting my answers and solutions and saying this is where we need to go, that maybe I should shut up and just stop talking and step back and really just spend more time in reading and reflection and contemplation around how do we get here? How do we even begin to think that you could separate economic from social and environmental value creation? And so I spent 2.5 years simply in this reading posture, if you will. I gave maybe 2 talks a year for 10 minutes apiece. And aside from that, I didn't give any keynotes or I didn't pontificate. I didn't do any of the paneling. And I just thought I want to understand more deeply, kind of like what happens. How do we end up in this bifurcated, dualistic place in order to, I think, have a better sense of maybe possibilities for going forward.
It's funny. I think I asked you in 2017 to be on this podcast, and it was in your reflection time. And you're like, if one more person asked me to talk about the state of impact investing, I'm going to scream or something like that.
Well, it's kind of a problem. You get kind of a bad attitude after a while. And I feel like I'm this curmudgeon in the field now, right? Which I don't want to like deflate our enthusiasm, but sometimes I'm just kind of like, oh my God, like really? Like we're still going to talk about metrics and shit? I mean, it's like, yeah. So anyway,
so what are some of the
to be with you now though? So
yeah. No, we're totally fine. And so what are some of the whys that you've been inspired by in that reflective process or speaking to others? Like what are some of the whys that you're like, that really deeply resonates with me, or you think has some deep truth to it?
Well, I think one of the things that I spent a lot of time exploring in the book is just the notion of dualism and how we approach what this is, quote unquote. And I think that because we come out of this assumption that the Enlightenment was actually correct, and in fact, we need to think about the physical versus the material. We need to think about, mind versus body. We need to think about doing well versus doing good. We simply bring that forward. And I think that one of my main questions or considerations that I've really sat with is this idea that the way we understand the nature and purpose of capital is itself a social construct. It is the outcome of really 4 centuries of people deliberating, coming around a set of definitions and terms, but again, all framed on that dualistic assumption of the world. And so what we're left with today is this idea, and this is what we teach at business schools, is that the purpose of capital is to seek its highest and best use. And we understand that highest and best use as a function of maximizing financial performance for a limited amount of risk exposure and liquidity lockup, in that capital's best use is the capital that is pursuing those investment opportunities that fit the profile of what it's trying to do in terms of optimizing for that financial performance. And yet, when we really stop to think about it, the purpose of capital is not to be a tool, but to be a fuel, and to be used to achieve things in the world. And I wanted to really spend time understanding this fact that, first off, each of us have the power and capacity to define the purpose of capital as we see fit. And we don't have to accept the definition of the purpose of capital that's given to us from the Chicago School of Economics, that's practiced on Wall Street, where the idea that somehow capital and economics is separate and apart from the value we're trying to create in our lives, separate and apart from separate and apart from environmental and social impacts, that this is all really whole. It's all of a part. And we need to start with that understanding that what we're trying to do is execute deployment of capital and wealth to optimize the total value that we have the potential to pursue in our lives. And that should be our orientation, as opposed to beginning with this assumption that somehow capital is separate and apart from what we're doing in the world and how we're being in the world.
And do you feel like your book is primarily targeted at investors or wealth holders? Or, like for example, if I am not wealthy, should I also, like, how do I as a layperson relate to the book?
I think that it's a reflection on purpose and meaning and value for lives, and the way that capital kind of moves through and influences and affects how we understand our personal meaning and value. And so it is certainly not simply for asset owners, although there is a lot of the discussion, of course, is around the lens or through the lens of impact investing. But I think that it's really it's a story of how we as humanity have grappled with these issues over the centuries. And I mean, and as you know from the book, I go back to like the axial age, which ran from 800 to 300 BCE. I build on the concepts of cognitive revolution, which basically is the idea that we developed the capacity to think, which laid the foundation and enabled us to begin to even consider the self, if you will, separate from tribe and community. So all of this is really rooted in our history of humanity's questioning and quest to try to understand meaning and purpose. And so in that way, it's really targeted at a broad audience. The trick, though, is that this is not an easy book. This is not a book that you can flip through and get the 5 points of purpose and then you're off to the races. My favorite comment that I've received about the book is from Chuck Leaf, who's the president of Naropa University, and he said what he really likes about it is that it's a book for grown-ups. You have to read it. And when you read it, it makes you think about, well, what do I believe about this? Or, that reminds me of this other writer who I really want to track and talk about. And one of the things that I tried to do in structuring the book is to say that there are so many authors and philosophies and traditions and practices that have grappled with these very issues, that we need to just pause and listen to that knowledge and wisdom and bring that into this conversation and discussion. And so the book makes extensive use of excerpts from other authors. My words are more of a linking narrative between and among these different ideas and experiences that we've had and that we share. And I think that what happens is it in the same way that the reading process itself took me to some very kind of deep and sometimes dark kind of places in terms of my own reflections, I think the book kind of catalyzes that for folks as well. The people I think who've enjoyed it most have been people who've been on international flights, where you get on the flight, you curl up and you start reading, and then you look up and it's like 8 or 9 hours later and you've just been kind of powering through this thing. And I think that's the trick, is that you need to either, read it chapter by chapter or read it straight through, but you need to take the time to really be in reflection, because what I've heard from people is that it raises issues and questions for us all.
One thing, we had spoke about this before the interview around the Decolonizing Wealth book with Edgar Villanueva and a few others. I'm curious, your thoughts on this, because it seems like from non-dual or from dualism came the idea of white superiority, where, we have colonialism starting. And I think and we see it at SOCAP, like, can we get more diverse people at SOCAP? And yet it's still the same structures and systems at SOCAP that are perhaps keeping people out. And I'm wondering, how does race and like power dynamics show up in this? Because it feels like it's a privilege for us as maybe white people to think like, yeah, what is the purpose of capital? And yet there's also people are dying, and in the streets there's, so what is the relationship do you see between race and some of the themes in the book? I'm curious how you approach that.
I spend a lot of time, first off, in the book, I actually say that the perspective that I'm exploring is from Western cultural kind of philosophies and perspective and experience. And that I'm not in any way, while I draw on a number of different traditions and perspective, I am not in any way trying to say that I'm going to explore those, because when I'm trying to understand how modern financial capitalism has evolved, that is a Western phenomena, if you will, when we think about modern financial capitalism. And so I'm very much aware of these related issues, but my focus was to try to say, how do we even get to this place? And what I'm just really intrigued by, and in fact, I sent Edgar an email the other day reaching out to him, because what I think is fascinating with all three of the books that people are kind of like talking about now, which is, Winners Take All, the Decolonizing Wealth, and then, the Purpose of Capital book, they're all lenses on the same set of interrelated phenomena. And what I think is just really powerful, quite frankly, is that each of those is needed in order to understand what this is. And so the part of it that speaks most directly to race in terms of the purpose of capital is the sections that explore self and other. And the whole idea of, again, this dualism, where I think that somehow who I am, my identity, and my prospects are different and separate and apart from yours, are different and separate and apart from the people who are the victims of the economic systems that we're talking about wanting to change and transform. The whole notion of stakeholder engagement and voice and connectivity. One of the points I make in the book is that we often start the impact investing conversation with a discussion of returns. How much is enough? What kind of financial performance do I need? What does, successful portfolio management look like for me as an investor? And I think the argument I make in the book is that if we expand our understanding of self to be inclusive of the other, then there isn't a question of what I'm giving up, because my success is a function of your success, and what we create together is what we should be focused on celebrating and moving toward and advancing. And so that speaks to how we understand the nature of returns and the value that we're creating. It speaks to being able to approach the capital conversation with a critique of modern financial capitalism. And that it's not enough to say, all we need is more and better capitalism in order to solve the issues that capitalism has created. We need to step back and fundamentally reconsider the power dynamics that you're referring to, the issue of race, the issue of connectivity between self and other. And it's through all of this that we will ultimately get to a place potentially where we have together discovered the solutions that I think are right in front of us. And so, and some of it is that we don't want to actually have that conversation, right? And this is where Anand's book, I think, speaks to just how embedded and entrenched the wealth is, and how easy it is for us to convince ourselves that we're the righteous and we're doing good, and it's okay that we still have masses and masses of wealth hanging out over here because we're making our impact investments over here, and aren't we all good and all that. And I explore and express much the same thing when I talk about how we should think about the management and purpose of wealth and capital. And so you have these like three perspectives that I think are fully complementary. And I think to really, I don't know which comes first. I think maybe Anand's book comes first in the sense that it's this broad critique of the current situation. He ends by talking about the need for more government, the need for greater transparency, the need for more democracy with regard to how capital is allocated, but comes at it from very much a kind of a public sector solution, if you will, that we need more of that. Whereas I think Edgar's piece is much more kind of indigenous spiritualism almost. It's kind of, it's that kind of frame around a holistic worldview. And that resonates so much for a lot of us, I think. And then I think mine is kind of more trying to connect kind of like those two parts, the kind of the Western understanding of capital and wealth with this emergent kind of understanding that needs to be informed by the wisdom traditions. And those come from a number of sources. But, in Buddhist practice, you cannot achieve nirvana until every member of the community has achieved enlightenment. And so it's that sense of wholeness and community and what I call mutual impact, that the individual asset owner needs to be as open to becoming transformed and changed through this investment process as the objects of our impact that we're asking to kind of recreate your life and change your situation and all that kind of stuff, right? And I think that this is part of what I'm saying is getting lost, is that because we've disintermediated capital, we have funds and we have firms and we have now Goldman Sachs, wants to be viewed as an impact investor when they have created, this financial system that has brought us to this point and seems not to be open to the idea that actually, no, you don't just get to hang out your banner, buy a firm and call yourself good, right? It doesn't fucking work that way. And so what I'm saying is that we need to blow up, the conversation in order to discover the conversation beneath this public conversation that we're having. And that as individuals, we all have this phenomenal chance and opportunity and fortune to be able to explore how to become more whole ourselves through the process of managing capital on both and terms as opposed to either or terms.
I love that analysis. And, I think one example that I'd be interested to get your thoughts on is I've spoken to a wealth holder, you know them, but I won't say who it is, who has a lot of money, hundreds of millions.
Can I guess?
Yeah.
No, I won't try to guess. Go ahead, please.
And they were saying to me, I inherited this wealth and my goal is, or my job is to steward. I can't make decisions that dramatically affect this. I need to steward the wealth for the next generation. And it feels like, Anand maybe would say from his perspective is like, you need to shake that person and be like, this money is not like, you need to give this money back. It was taken from, this slavery, and then it's being tax sheltered currently. And so the purpose, like, is it that person's even ability to be like, it is my purpose of my capital, or should we just be like shaking these people and be like, you have, like, this money should not be stewarded to the next generation. Like, you should try to liquidate your assets to people who need it now, or right. I don't know. What is your thoughts on that whole thing?
So here's the trick. I don't think it's my place to tell anybody anything. Right? I think that people need to, through their own processes, reach the right answers for who they are, for where they are, for how they are kind of in the world. And the problem I have with folks who say, the purpose of my capital is to be stewarded for my family's next generation is, I get that from a traditional kind of financial capitalism, fiduciary duty definition of purpose, right? I don't get that from an understanding of meaning and value and impact, if you will. And I think that part of the trick is we each need to be brutally honest with ourselves relative to those questions and understand that the whole notion of fiduciary duty, the whole notion of that the purpose of capital is to be aggregated and then managed in a very concentrated way down through the generations. These are ideas and constructs that we've created. There is nothing here that was given by God that said, this is how it has to be. And we can change that. And these are assumptions and these are understandings that we've created that happen to work very well for each of us in this little moment of time. But the problem is when you understand life and meaning as beyond your little moment of life, you start to understand that in fact, capital is energy, that you can't hold on to capital like sand that falls through your fingers when you hold it clenched. That capital actually is a resource and a fuel and an energy that is stewarded, and that you are managing on behalf not only of your children, but of the planet's children, and that there are broader considerations, again, of self and other, that we need to bring to this discussion. And I think that part of what happens is you get families where you have multi-generations, and the further away from the wealth creation you get, the more you begin to be viewed as an object of wealth yourself, and the less you become viewed as who you, quote, are. And then, therefore, the more issues you end up having with wealth, because is it mine? Is it yours? Do I deserve this? Like how all the responsibility and the obligation, as opposed to the opportunity and the possibilities of capital come to the fore. And so I think that what we need to do is, again, first we have to, it's just like with substance abuse, you have to realize you have a problem and you have to, call it for what it is. And in some cases you have to hit a bottom relative to the experience of being with that capital.
How do you, as a wealth holder, maybe there's wealth holders listening to this, and like, how do you talk to them, or how do you help them get past that block, or what should they be thinking about?
Well, I think that one of the things we need to remember is that we are all trapped. It may be a little nicer to be trapped with a lot of money than not, but this understanding of capital, this understanding of the mainstream purpose of capital is simply to make more money, traps advisors into a certain role and posture. It traps fund managers who have to pitch and always have the right answer and the right solution. It traps wealth holders, and it traps wealth seekers. And so I think the first thing we need to recognize is that we actually have created these traps for ourselves. And the first step to moving out of those traps is to, number one, call it for what it is. And number two, go deeper ourselves in terms of what it is that we want to have our lives really be about, and what is the value that we want to manifest over the course of a life. What's the real living legacy that we want our life to be about? And seldom is the answer to that, I want to have more money than I started, and I want to die with this big pile of cash that's going to choke my kids to death, right? Usually it is about values and meaning and purpose and self-realization. I mean, all of these things. And money is simply a byproduct of pursuing some of those goals. And people who are business people who've created companies, there may be ambitions around wealth and becoming wealthier, but usually it starts with an understanding of an opportunity to create value in a market or for a client base or customer base. And that's the starting place, and then money is just a byproduct of creating that value, if you will. And so I think that what I'm asking us to do is to understand that value as more, much more than simply financial and economic value, but that it is, in my words, a blended value proposition that we're pursuing and needs to be managed on that basis.
So one hypothetical would be, so let's say I go to my why and I decide I want to create locally self-reliant economies or something. That's for, that our Lift economy motto is creating locally self-reliant economies for the benefit of all life. And so one of the things we've seen is that market rate returns, or like investments where you're like, I guess I see challenge in this whole idea of like, you have your impact and you have this, like, impact does not mean you will lose financial returns. Like, that's like a big thing at SOCAP, right? Like, we can have impact and we can have the same returns and they're good investments. But isn't that problematic? Like, don't we not want to have the same returns if we're already wealthy and like already asset holders?
Right.
It's like, don't we?
But again, this is what I'm saying, is that we're starting from where we are and simply creating conversations around where we are. And I think that if the starting place is an assumption that you have to give up something that between doing well and doing good, if the starting place is that these are two separate considerations as opposed to one thing, and one thing being optimizing total blended value, then you get lost in these conversations around how much is enough, and you have to give up what percentage, and what's the right return, and what are the benchmarks, and all this kind of stuff, when these are fundamentally the wrong things that we should be focusing on, because they're all grounded in a bifurcated, dualistic understanding of self and other in the world. And therefore, of course, you go to that place. And so what I'm saying is that actually, if we just pause and step back and really go both kind of deeper and higher in terms of our exploration of meaning and purpose and value, we will be able to move forward in a more coherent, clear way, because we'll see that future instead of being muddied by our current understanding of what is and what the possibilities are. And so I get what you're saying, and I'm saying that what's wrong with this conversation is that I get what you're saying. And we need to really just stop.
You're like a Jedi.
No, Jedi. So I'm telling you, man, it's a total. So here's the other thing, right? This gets even better. Is that okay? So you take the doing well, doing good kind of thing, and you understand that as a form of kind of yin yang dualism, right? You do well or you do good, this kind of thing. So what we should really focus on isn't that yin yang, but the Tao, the unified power of rising above dualism and understanding the illusion of separation with regard to capital and community. And when you go there and you really sit with that and you explore for yourself how you understand that, I can guarantee you the question is not how much money do you have to give up in order to advance a value proposition in the world. And so this is part of what I'm saying, is that, okay, it's great to have, the critique and the analytic framework about what's wrong with wealth holders. It's great to have a culturally grounded kind of frame that we can use to understand how to get out of this box. And ultimately, each of us, in our own way, on our own path, have got to figure this out. And so this is where I feel like we're trapped, is that we're in this market that expects you to have a solution for me, when in fact, the solution that I seek is myself.
You're a Buddhist. You have to be a Buddhist.
I'm a really bad Buddhist. I'm horrible. I'm not a good Buddhist. But in any event, and this is where it gets really funny, because if you think about all this stuff, like, we're all going to be dead like pretty soon. And if you think about the planet is in the process of dying right now. And so the questions of risk, return, and liquidity outside of impact are really kind of irrelevant to like the ultimate questions that we should be grappling with. And as we connect more deeply with those questions, the solutions kind of evolve. They emerge out of this process. And so this is why, in talking about the book, I haven't done any keynotes. I haven't like stood up and said, okay, here's how we need to think about it. Because what I'm saying is that the way that we need to think about it will best evolve out of a conversation between perspectives, and that the truth that you have with a small t is as good and as valid as the truth that I have with a small t, but it's in between those two truths that we discover truth with a capital T. And so that's what I'm asking that we spend more time sitting with in order to be more humble as we approach this conversation. One of the things that I really have reacted very badly to in the last couple of years is with the number of new firms that have entered this space with their solutions and the volume and hubris with which these folks are promoting their strategy and I'm kind of like, holy cow. These guys have trillions of dollars invested in the systems that have destroyed our earth.
Yeah.
And they think because they can raise $1 billion or $3 billion off of a brand that you and I have created, right, that somehow that makes them impact investors. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but this is where I'm a bad Buddhist because I'm extremely judgmental. But I really think we need to raise the bar. It's kind of like, oh, great, good. You raise that money off our brand. Guess what? You're not God's gift to poverty. There's going to be accountability. There has to be transparency. And quite frankly, you need to enter this conversation from a place of humility because you've only begun this process. And you've no idea what emerges out of being truly deeply connected to these issues, to this struggle, to this process. And I think all of us, again, the thing is, when you read a lot, you actually realize how stupid you are, right? And how little you understand about anything. And as I went through this process of shutting up and listening to humanity as represented in the context of these books, these traditions, these philosophies, the more I understood how little I really get about any of this. And the more really humbled I felt in the face of the knowledge that we have over centuries and centuries and centuries. And I'm talking like 10 to 20,000 years, not like 4 centuries of capitalism. And so this is what just galls me, is when I listen to the trap that we've gotten in, where basically you have any number of us who enter and lead with our answer, as opposed to sitting more deeply with the questions that we as a community will find possible solutions for. And I think that the danger of simply adopting traditional financial capitalist approaches, whether it's a fund structure or an investment instrument or what have you, is that we somehow think that that structure is appropriate to our task, and we're confusing kind of tool with task. And what we need to do is understand that any of these tools are irrelevant if they're not vehicles for achieving justice and equity and sustainability in the planet and the world. And if anything, some of the traditional finance folks who are coming into this conversation should lead with apologies for having created this system and profited from it. And they've made their millions, and now they want us to embrace them as leaders of impact. And I'm just saying, I'm going to call bullshit on that.
One thing that happened to me at this recent SOCAP is I was talking to a friend of mine, a woman of color, and I was saying, I've been really grappling with this dualism and non-dualism, but then where did white supremacy and colonialism? And she's like, what are you talking about? Who cares? Like, that's the problem with white people, is you're always thinking, like, you're off into like we need you here, like doing things, so one of the concerns I guess I have is like I totally agree with the idea that, we should each find our own why. But if we're not surrounding ourselves with people like low-income communities of color or others who are at the receiving end, the negative receiving end of a lot of our decisions about capital, then how can we ever come to the why that's meaningful for others?
That's exactly why we have to pursue these questions in the context of community and dialogue. That the idea that any of us, myself included, have somehow the unique and only insight, and that what happens is then I end up trying to convince you of my righteousness and my perspective, as opposed to us being in conversation around that and finding a new why, if you will. That comes out of our mutual experience, but is informed by our history and traditions and experience. I mean, I would say, no, you don't need more kind of pseudo-guilty white guys running around. And that is the legacy that I bring to this conversation. I'm a 59-year-old, white man who, has 2 graduate degrees and, has worked with ultra high net worth individuals. That's the way it is. I started in community, I started in street work, I started in a whole host of things that are much more compelling in terms of, their impact orientation. but this is what I do. It's what I am. It's how I've evolved through this process. And as long as I know that I have to shut up and listen to these other voices, it's okay to be a 59-year-old white guy. Where it gets in trouble is when you have too many 59-year-old white guys standing up telling other people what the solutions are, how they should be thinking. And this goes back to my whole challenge around how we understand the nature of impact. And the problem with the current conversations around impact is that they are all other directed. It is me having impact on you and on your life and who you are. And it's what are the metrics that I'm going to use to assess your impact? And it's kind of like, wait a minute, like that's not a good way to have this conversation. And so what I'm saying is that it is in dialogue, and we have to have it be dialogue of stakeholders, not shareholders, and that these are things that we know already, right? This is not new stuff. Like this is Saul Alinsky from the 60s. This is Jane Addams, from the 1920s. This is old stuff that we've just forgotten in our enthusiasm for doing well and doing good and finding impact instruments that can make us wealthy and feel good about ourselves. This is why, again, I'm arguing in the book that we just need to stop and listen and try to adopt a posture of humility as we go forward in this process together.
Who are the people that you said, I think you read 170 books or something like that?
Like 240 something.
Oh my gosh, it's increased.
This is the number. It hasn't increased. That was the number.
That was the number. Okay.
Yeah.
So who resonated with you, or like if you were to say to listeners, like this is sort of that, like, I know you're resisting like the top 5 next actions based on my book, but are there authors or thought leaders or others that you can point to say, I really resonated with this person, or like this line?
So here's the trick. So I'll answer your question, but first I have to say, the problem with the question is that it assumes a static posture relative to knowledge and much less wisdom. And so it says that like the books that I read at the start of my kind of process, I read a number of books I was just like, man, this is great. Like this really pulls it together. It's just blah, blah. And then like 6 months later, I'd read some other book and I'd be like, wow, like this is so much better than that book, right? And it's kind of like, where you stand depends on where you sit, right? You need to understand that you're in a certain place.
You're a pretty good Buddhist, Jed. I don't know what you're talking about.
And well, that's the other one I like is that Buddhist thing, don't do something, sit there. Because I think that, anyway, and so I guess when I look at the readings that I've done, they have resonated and been meaningful to me on the basis not of what the author has said, but on where I was in my own process of understanding. And so that's why in the book I have, my best books, but I don't have a top 10 list. And my best books, I think I've got like 30 books or something. And I would argue that better list is the bibliography, because if you go through and you look at these 240 titles, you will find titles that will resonate with you, and you will say, wow, like that's really interesting. I want to go read that person, right? And you'll get sucked forward into that process. And so there are people like Arne Næss, who's the Norwegian philosopher who coined the concept of deep ecology. There's people like Baruch Spinoza, who's the philosopher who framed God as substance and as being and becoming as a part of our connectivity with substance. Einstein was asked if he believed in God, and he said, I believe in Spinoza's God, right? And so there's people like Karen Armstrong, who's a religious...
The Spinoza's God's like not the personal God, right? It's the more mystical...
It is. See, here's the thing that I find really interesting, because I was raised in a Presbyterian tradition. I have always felt the presence of Jesus Christ in my life with me. And I feel that it is a personal and spiritual transcendent understanding of substance as manifest, in my case, culturally, as Jesus Christ. And I'm not a confessing Christian. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like, I think that there are so many aspects of this that are beyond labels. And I have, again, a whole discussion around words as actually hindering the ability to communicate. Because as soon as I use a word, you hear a definition or a term that may or may not be exactly what I'm trying to talk about or express or communicate. And so this is why, again, I'm just a really bad kind of Buddhist or Taoist, because, there's also the Taoist saying, first mistake, open mouth. And I think that this is the problem, is that as soon as we do this, we have to spend so much time kind of clarifying terms and assumptions and conditions. And so, we just have to be in the process. We have to be in community. We have to be present. I think that's one of the biggest challenges with impact investing, is that so many impact investors are disintermediated from their capital, and they're not present in the process of becoming and creating a new reality by virtue of the capital, and what that capital can be a fuel to help create in community.
And I would maybe even add, maybe the default community that we have is not the right community necessarily, because as white people, we sometimes are naturally just among other people who think like us, like at SOCAP. So maybe it's intentionally disrupting our own community to bring in more voices that aren't like ours. Yeah.
No, but I think it's a great point. I was on a panel, I think it was last year, with some folks, and we were talking about the election, and I was saying just how shocked I was that Trump had won, and that part of my kind of coming to grips with everything was just this sense of oh my God, how could this happen? And a colleague of mine, who's an older Black woman, said to me, the only people who were surprised by the outcome of that election were white people. And that if you were a person of color, you've seen this coming for a long time. And you've experienced this growing kind of rise of public racism in society, and anti-Semitism. And it was just, and the thing that was great was that she was totally correct. And she made her point in a way that didn't make me feel like I was somehow the bad guy. And it was this statement of kind of challenge and love that I found really powerful. And then the whole conversation went into a whole nother space. And it was great, because you look around the room and every person of color was just nodding their head, and not in a kind of a fuck you, Jed kind of way, but kind of she's speaking truth. This is real. And I think, again, this is why, especially for white men, we're so used to being given the space and permission to lead with our mouth and to basically tell people what's real, that it's really hard. You really have to have a practice yourself of pulling yourself up and saying, I'm not going to speak. I'm going to be quiet. I'm not going to try to come up with what I think while that person is talking, so that I can have a really pithy response. I'm going to really sit and be present with what that person is saying. And so I think that it really requires a shift on our part. And I think, again, begins with the individual kind of recognizing the need for that change. And that's not something that you can shame people into. It's something you can call people's attention to. And I think that's the process that we're moving into. And so this is, again, I think that the three books that we were talking about are really interesting perspectives, all on this fundamental question of how are we called to be present in the face of this phenomenal challenge that we have before us.
So last few questions here, because I want to be respectful of your time. What do people never ask you that you wish they did?
Wow. I don't know, to tell you the truth. That's a really interesting question. I have not sat with that question. I think that part of what happens in these conversations is that it's not so much that there are questions that aren't asked as places that we could explore, that we don't have time or the opportunity to explore. And so it's less there's a particular question than the conversation kind of moves in a certain direction and you kind of go there. My father passed away about 2 months ago, and I had the fortune to be present with him all the way through his death. We could have talked for a half hour about that experience and how that has really helped me be at peace and to be focused on what matters. We could talk about experiences that I had working with street kids that I still kind of carry within me today when I think about the work I do with families. I think that, I have an MBA, I have a master's in social work. I use my MSW a lot more than I use my MBA because at the end of the day, this really is about relationship. It's about relationship with yourself, and it's about relationship with self and other. And so there's so many different parts to this rich kind of conversation that we could explore. So it's not so much the question that wasn't asked as the opportunities that we just didn't have the opportunity to explore in this particular interaction.
We'll just get you back on the show again.
Yeah, I'm sure
Next
there will be massive demand from a lot of our friends. But anyway.
Last two things here. So one of the questions we like to ask is, what do you need right now? And how can the listeners of this show help you grow this new economy or this next economy?
Sure. I think what I've really struggled with is trying to see what is the best way for me to manifest the ideas in the book, and how do you do this? Like, how do you bring this conversation forward? And I think that through the fall, what I've done has been this type of thing, to be in dialogue with folks around these issues and to explore kind of like what I mean, what you're hearing, what the next question becomes. I wonder if the next step, for not just relative to what I'm trying to do with the book, but for this larger conversation, is to try to understand what are the various networks out there that we could be moving this discussion into. And again, not a discussion around this strategy or this tactic, but rather the sets of questions that are most relevant for the actors within that network. And what I'm trying to do is find groups of folks who are interested and open to this part of the conversation and connect with them and try to figure out, like, how can I affiliate with these networks in that way, as opposed to working kind of family by family. Are there ways that I can leverage kind of my energies and the research that I've done to help facilitate kind of groups of people having these types of conversations? And so ideas or opportunities or things that folks who are listening to this, when they think, wow, and I don't mean like coming and talking to 10 people, in a deep way, because that I can only do so many of those too, but it's also something different than come and keynote our conference next year. So there's some other way that I want to be engaged with our community, and I'm not quite sure, like, what is that best way to do that? So ideas that people would have around those kind of opportunities or strategies would be appreciated.
Great. And where can folks go to learn more about you and pick up the book and all that good stuff?
Well, first off, we've talked a lot about the book, but I'm not really interested in selling the book. I don't know if you're too young to remember, but Abby Hoffman had a book in the early 70s called Steal This Book. It was about radical politics and rejection of capitalism and all that. And so I almost feel like I should have titled my book Steal This Book, but you can't, because I'm giving it away. So all you have to do is go to the website, www.purposeofcapital.org. And you can download the ebook version of this for free, and it's in multiple formats. So whatever kind of thing you use, you can do that. I've waived royalties on the book. I self-published the book, so I could kind of cut out the middleman, if you will. And so I think the paperback is like $10 or $11, and the hardback is like $20 or $22 or something. And so I've tried to make this as accessible as possible, so folks who are interested in this can just get it. And again, the big thing is whatever people can do to just get this thing out there. And it's not that the book has answers for you, but I think it can direct us toward thinking and perspective from history that can be very powerful as applied in the present time in our context of trying to use capital to optimize value. And so I really do hope people take the time to read it and sit with it and tear it apart and use it as a springboard toward wherever else you're headed. So anyway, so that's that.
Great. Well, it's fantastic because just in this interview, I think that you've done a great job of like sort of trying to delineate the why and then not let us slip into the how, which I think is really important because that's where it's probably where humans just naturally like end up in our current mind state. And so I think what you're trying to do is to push us back towards the larger questions and to say, no, you really need to sit here and think about this. This is really important. So just want to appreciate you for that. Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.